Ever heard of a theological debate so heated it could rival, like, a modern-day rap battle?
Haha, I like that analogy.
Well, get ready to dive into one that shaped the course of Islamic thought. The Sifat controversy.
And you're right to frame it as a controversy because these weren't just, polite disagreements over tea and biscuits. This was about the very essence of God.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Sifat means attributes in Arabic, right?
That's right.
So I'm gathering this whole debate is about how do you reconcile God having attributes with the idea of tawhid, that God is absolutely one and indivisible.
Exactly. It's a real head scratcher when you think about it. How do you describe something infinite, something beyond human comprehension without limiting it with your words? It's a dilemma that's challenged theologians for centuries.
Yeah, I can see how that could get complicated. So thinking about early Islam, we're talking Quran, Hadith. Wouldn't you think those sources would offer pretty clear guidelines on this? I mean, where did this whole debate even come from?
That's where things get interesting. See, early Islam wasn't some isolated bubble. As it spread, it encountered this whole melting pot of different philosophical and theological ideas, especially from Greek philosophy and Eastern Christianity.
So like a cross-cultural exchange of ideas.
Precisely. And some figures played especially influential roles in this exchange.
Okay, I'm curious. Give me names.
Well, take Philo of Alexandria, for instance. He was wrestling with this very problem centuries earlier, trying to reconcile his Jewish faith with Greek philosophical thought.
Trying to make those two fit together seems like a challenge and a half.
Exactly. And Philo came up with this intriguing approach called via negativa. Instead of saying what God is, you describe him by what he is not.
Interesting. So instead of saying God is all-powerful, you'd say something like, God is not weak.
Precisely. It's about avoiding any comparisons that might, box God in. And this approach, this via negativa, really resonated with Muslim thinkers, especially those debating the Sifat.
Because it avoids making God too human-like, too limited by our understanding.
Exactly. And the influence doesn't stop there. We also have to consider someone like Pseudo-Dionysius, a Christian mystic who emphasized God's absolute transcendence. His writings, full of this language about God's unknowable nature, were circulating in the Islamic world and feeding into this theological ferment.
So we've got Greek philosophy, we've got early Christian mysticism, all these streams feeding into the Sifat debate. Were there any other, maybe unexpected players in this mix?
You might be surprised to learn that a Christian theologian actually living under Muslim rule got caught up in this theological whirlwind.
Wait, really? Who are we talking about?
John of Damascus. He was a fierce defender of Christian doctrines, even writing critiques of Islam. But here's the twist.
I do love a good twist.
His writings, even those critical of Islam, ended up sparking important conversations within the Islamic world.
So even his attempts to defend his own faith inadvertently fueled this Islamic debate about God's attributes.
Exactly. For example, John of Damascus was a big proponent of the Trinity, a concept that obviously differs from Islamic beliefs. But his detailed arguments about the nature of God, about how you can have both unity and distinction within the divine.
Those sparked Muslim thinkers to kind of re-examine their own understandings.
Precisely. It's a fascinating example of how ideas can transcend religious boundaries and spark debate, even when they're meant to, refute one another.
It really makes you wonder if those scholars ever realized how influential their debates would become. So we've got all these philosophical heavy hitters setting the stage. But how did these abstract ideas actually play out on the ground in the Islamic world? How did they trickle down, so to speak? Well, we've talked about the big thinkers and the ideas that were sort of swirling around. But how did this debate about God's attributes actually, play out within Islam? Did people take these ideas to their extreme?
Oh, absolutely. The Sifat controversy wasn't just some theoretical discussion happening in a vacuum. It led to some very passionate, even radical stances.
Give me an example. Who really took this via negativa idea and, ran with it?
Well, think about a guy named JAHM ibn Safwan. He took this idea of God's absolute transcendence to, you could say its limit. Imagine someone saying, God doesn't have hands like ours. He doesn't see or hear like we do. That's the kind of comparison John was pushing back against.
So he was totally against giving God any human-like qualities.
Exactly. John believed that even saying things like God is powerful or knowing was putting limitations on him because those words are ultimately defined by our limited human experience.
So you'd say those words are just, not good enough to describe God?
Right. He argued that even the Quran's descriptions of God, like having a hand or a face, Those were to be understood metaphorically, not literally.
So John was all about emphasizing God's, otherness, his total difference from creation, where all the radicals on that side of the debate, the God has no attribute side.
Not necessarily. You also had someone like Jada ibn Dirham. He went in a different direction and actually questioned the eternal nature of the Quran itself.
Wait, how did the Sifat controversy lead to questions about the Quran? Those seem like two completely separate issues.
They're more connected than you might think. Jahd ibn Dirham's argument went something like this. If God's speech is an attribute, and attributes are created, then logically, the Quran, as God's speech, must also be created.
That's a pretty bold claim. So he's essentially saying the Quran, wasn't always with God?
Yes, he believed that the Quran was revealed by God in time and space, making it a creation, not something co-eternal with God.
I can only imagine how that went over in the Islamic world. Talk about a controversial take.
You're absolutely right. And it's a stark reminder that these weren't just abstract theological debates. These ideas, they had real-world consequences for people.
So what happened? Did people just have polite disagreements about the nature of the Quran?
Hardly. These debates could get heated, even dangerous. In fact, Jahd ibn Dirham's views were considered so radical that he was executed for heresy.
Wow. That really highlights, the stakes involved here. It makes sense, though. You're talking about the very foundations of faith. So you've got these radical thinkers pushing the boundaries. But how did the broader Islamic community respond to this whole Sifat controversy?
Well, in a way, these debates were like a pressure cooker for Islamic thought. They forced scholars to really grapple with these complex questions and articulate their own positions. And out of this theological ferment emerged those distinct schools of Islamic theology you've probably heard of.
Oh, right, like the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazila schools. So these schools were basically trying to figure out how to make sense of God's attributes in a way that, preserved his absolute oneness.
You could say that's the common thread, yeah. Let's start with the ATHARI school. They took what you might call a more literal approach to the Quran and Hadith, really trying to avoid any philosophical speculation that might complicate things.
So they were more about, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, no need to overthink it.
That's a good way to put it. They really emphasized reliance on the revealed texts and sort of the pronouncements of those early Muslim authorities.
It sounds like they were trying to, steer clear of the controversy altogether by just sticking to the text itself. What about the Ash'ari school? Where did they land on this spectrum?
They sought more of a middle ground, I'd say. The Ash'aris, they believed that God does have attributes, but they also emphasize that our human minds are simply too limited to fully grasp their true nature.
So acknowledging the attributes, but emphasizing the mystery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, think about the sun. We can see the sun, we can feel its warmth, but we can't fully comprehend its vastness or all the complex processes that are happening within it. The Ash'aris would say it's similar with God's attributes. They're real, but trying to define them too rigidly is, well, it's a fool's errand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about the Mu'tazila school? I know they were really big on reason. Did that influence their stance on God's attributes at all?
Absolutely. The Mu'tazila were deeply, deeply committed to this idea of God's absolute unity, his oneness, and his rationality. And they worried that if God had eternal attributes, attributes that were separate from his essence, it would compromise that oneness.
It's like saying that God is divisible, made up of parts.
Right. So they came up with this idea that God's attributes aren't actually separate things, but are actually identical to his essence. So when we say God is knowledgeable, it's not that he has knowledge, it's that he is knowledge.
Interesting. So for the Mu'tazila, it seems like upholding God's unity, that was the most important thing. Now, I remember you mentioned earlier that this debate about God's attributes got tangled up with another, let's say, controversial topic, the nature of the Quran itself.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting. And you could even say dangerous.
Okay, so last time we were talking about how that debate about God's attributes got tangled up with the nature of the Quran itself.
Exactly. It's like those two tracks are running parallel and they intersect at this really crucial point. Right. Remember how we were talking about Jahd ibn Dirham and how he argued that the Quran was created, not eternal?
Yeah.
Well, the Mu'tazila school, with their big emphasis on reason and God's absolute unity, they ended up kind of championing this idea as well.
Because if God's attributes are eternal, it challenges the idea that God is one.
Exactly. And for the Mu'tazila, if the Quran is God's eternal speech, that would imply some kind of duality within God.
So his essence and his speech are internally existing next to each other.
Exactly.
So to maintain that God is absolutely one, They had to say that the Quran was created.
Precisely. They argued that the Quran, as God's speech, must have, come into being at a certain point in time.
Wow. That's a really controversial stance to take. You're talking about the very word of God. What was the reaction to this?
Let's just say it caused quite a stir. In fact, this whole debate over the created Quran, it led to a period of intense persecution that's known as the Mina.
The Mina. What was that?
So imagine a climate of suspicion, fear, where scholars and judges were pressured to declare their stance on the Quran's createdness.
Oh, wow.
Some were even imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile for refusing to, to conform to the official view that the Quran was eternal.
Are you serious? People were actually persecuted for their theological views on this.
Yeah. It's a pretty stark reminder that these weren't just abstract theological debates happening in some ivory tower somewhere. These debates, they had real-world consequences, really shaping the political and religious landscape at the time.
Yeah, it really makes you realize just how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
Ideas, beliefs, politics, everything. It's been really fascinating to trace how these debates played out and how they ultimately gave rise to those different schools of Islamic theology.
And the impact of those schools of thought, the Ash'ari, the Mu'tazila, the ATHARI, it didn't just disappear after the Sifat controversy or the Mina.
Right.
These schools of thought, they continued to evolve, and they went on to influence Islamic law, philosophy, even spirituality for centuries.
So these debates from, centuries ago, they still kind of resonate in the Islamic world today.
Absolutely. Their echoes are still heard in mosques, in madrasas, in the writings of scholars, and even in the interpretations of, everyday Muslims.
Wow. It really shows the lasting power of ideas. So for someone like me, or for our listeners who are not scholars of Islam, who are not theologians, why does any of this matter? What can we take away from all this talk about God's attributes and created Qurans and all of that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think these debates, they offer us a really unique glimpse into this very human struggle to try to understand the divine. It's something that people of all faiths grapple with. How do you talk about something that's infinite, something that's ultimately unknowable? How do you reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas about God's nature?
Yeah, those are tough questions.
Exactly, and there are no easy answers. But I think grappling with these questions, even if we don't arrive at some kind of definitive answer, I think it can deepen our own faith, our own understanding. And I think it can also foster a sense of humility. It reminds us that our human language and all the categories that we use, they're always going to fall short when we're trying to really grasp the divine.
Yeah, I love that. Approaching these big questions with humility, with curiosity, not necessarily expecting that we're going to find these easy answers. It's been really eye-opening for me to kind of explore these early debates and to realize that even something as fundamental as God's attributes, it's been a subject of such intense discussion and even disagreement.
And those discussions, as heated as they may have been, ultimately enriched and deepened Islamic thought. And they led to this really vibrant tapestry of different interpretations and perspectives that continue to this day.
It makes you realize there's always more to learn. There's always more to explore. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Sifat controversy. We've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully this has given you a taste of this complex and fascinating chapter in Islamic history. As always, we've included some resources in the show notes if you're interested in exploring further. Until next time, keep those intellectual gears turning, and remember there's always more to discover.